And this is a part 3 of the shadow work. And this part is really simple, but this is what I do kind of want to elaborate on. Understand this: when you are dealing with people, you have to stop seeing people for who you want them to be. And you really, really have to thoroughly look at the person's soul. You have to ask the person, what type of healing have you done? What type of shadow work have you done? A lot of the times, the reason why, and I'm speaking this for myself because I've dealt with this multiple times, more times than I can count, is that when you are doing the shadow work on your own self, you literally have to be able to question other people, whether you're dating, whether you're finna get in a relationship, whatever. You have to stop looking at people as how you want them to be for you. And you have to really ask these people, and even if they don't tell you the truth, you have to look at these people and understand what type of healing has this person done. What type of shadow work has this person done on themselves? Have they even done the shadow work on themselves? Are they even willing to do the shadow work on themselves? Have they even started their own healing process? It comes to a point when you start to do the shadow work on yourself, you will start to look at other people and look and require yourself to deal with somebody that is actually doing the shadow work on their own selves. You will start to look at dating or just dealing with people in a way where you're able to look at people and understand, okay, are you starting to do the healing process on your own self? So it's almost like when you are already in the process of working on your own shadow work, you will have to learn that as you get out here and date again and be in relationships, you have to choose so carefully who is actually doing their own shadow work, who is actually in the process of doing their own healing. Because this is what happens often, is that we start to do the shadow work on ourselves, but then we get involved and start to deal with other people that's not even nearly ready to do the shadow work. Somebody that's not even nearly ready to even do the healing that they need to do on themselves. And so the best thing I say when it comes to the shadow work is that you get to a point in your life where you understand that you want to connect yourself with somebody that's already doing their own shadow work, that's already focused on doing their own healing, so that you don't have to continue to come into dynamics and carry a heavy burden to where you're doing the shadow work, you're doing your own healing, but yet you're connected to somebody that's not even doing their shadow work. You're connected to somebody that's not even willing to even take the steps or the process to even try to heal the shadow work. So this was just a small part 3 of the shadow work, that as you do the shadow work on yourself, it's going to require you to see people for who they are, not for who you want them to be for you. It's going to require for you to understand that you have to align yourself with somebody else that's actually working on their own shadow work and working on their own healing just as well as you. Because what you're going to do is find yourself in dynamics again where you're dealing with somebody that is not doing the shadow work, that's not even close to wanting to heal, and you'll repeat the same cycle over and over again. So as you do the shadow work on yourself, as you do the healing on yourself, pick partners, pick people, pick dynamics, pick relationships. I'm not just talking about romantically, I'm talking about friend wise, everything. Pick these connections and these relationships with people, not with who you want them to be for you, but who they are. And when you understand this, you will start to pick your connections differently with people. You'll start to choose your connections with people differently. You'll stop looking at how you want people to be for you, and you'll start understanding that, okay, this is who the person really is. And if they're not ready to do their shadow work, if they're not even nearly ready to even start some type of level of healing, that's okay too. You know what I'm saying? You don't have to beat anybody up for what they choose not to want to do. That just means that you get to choose to exit that situation. You get to choose to disconnect from that connection because it's not going to be in alignment with where you're going or what you're trying to do for yourself. And so when you are doing the shadow work on yourself, it's going to require you to stop looking at people for who you want them to be in the perspective of how you want them to be for you, and more of who they already are, and more of, okay, are they willing to do the shadow work? Are they willing to take the steps to heal what needs to be healed within themselves? Not based off of you doing it for them or carrying the baggage for both of y'all, but them doing it for themselves. And when you align yourself with a person like that, you'll start to see that you trying to do the shadow work on yourself, and you trying to do the healing that it comes for yourself, it won't be an interference when it comes to that other person, because they're already in a mindset of trying to do the shadow work on their own self. They're already in the mindset of trying to do the healing on their own selves. Is it to say that it's going to be perfect? It's not. But here's what I always say, and I always said this even when it came to David, all of them in the Bible. God did not need a perfect vessel. I promise you, God did not need a perfect vessel. But God just was desiring, and God needed a willing vessel. David was not a perfect vessel, but David was a willing vessel that was willing to do the shadow work, that was willing to do the healing. David was not a perfect vessel, but God chose David because David was a willing vessel. The woman with the issue of blood, she was not a perfect vessel, but she was a willing vessel that God knew he could use, because she was willing to do the shadow work. She was willing to do whatever it took to get to Jesus that day in order to get her healing, so she can be made whole and different. She was willing to do whatever it took to do the healing and the shadow work. God did not need the woman with the issue of blood to be perfect. He just needed her to be a willing vessel. God did not need Peter to be perfect, but God needed Peter to be a willing vessel. And even when Peter denied Jesus 3 times, God knew Peter was going to do what Peter was going to do and deny him. But God also knew, I don't need Peter to be perfect, but I need him to be a willing vessel. And that's why God chose Peter to do certain things for him, on behalf of God, on behalf of Jesus, because God knew Peter is far from perfect. Peter is far from perfect, but he's a willing vessel, and I can work with that. When you look at Saul in the Bible, Saul was not a willing vessel. Saul was not willing to do the shadow work that it took to heal what needed to be healed within him. Saul was not willing to do the work that it took to heal the things that God needed him to heal. Saul was not a willing vessel. So therefore God dethroned Saul, and God brought Saul off of the king's throne and gave it to David, because David was a willing vessel, not a perfect vessel, but a willing vessel. Saul was not a willing vessel at all. And even if you look at it like this, with David and Goliath, David was not perfect, but he was a willing vessel, to where Saul and the rest of the army was afraid of Goliath. But David was a willing vessel that God knew he could use that day to defeat Goliath. But God knew that David was the one he could use to defeat him. David wasn't perfect, but David was a willing vessel to even be used, even in that type of situation. Even when you look at Paul in the Bible, Paul was not a perfect vessel. Paul was not a man of perfection. But Paul was a willing vessel that God knew he could use. So my point I'm making is this: even when you look at Moses was not a perfect vessel for God. I promise you he wasn't. Moses had his own flaws and his own issues. Moses was not the perfection. Moses was not the perfect candidate. But God was not looking for the perfect candidate in Moses. God just needed Moses to be a willing vessel. And because Moses was a willing vessel, God could utilize him. God could give him everything God was going to give him. And God was able to use Moses for great things. Even when you look at the book of Psalms and everything that David wrote in the book of Psalms, David wrote all of the book of Psalms and things based off his pain, the revelation, the things that he knew that God was going to bring him out of, but he had to sit in his shadow work in order for God to move the way God was going to move with David. And David literally took all his pain and his suffering and his losses and he turned it into the book of Psalms. David was not a perfect vessel, but a willing vessel for God. And that's why God was able to utilize David to write certain parts in the book of Psalms, because God knew I could utilize David. I could utilize him as a willing vessel because his heart is willing. And that is what I want to say when it comes to the shadow work. You can have everything you desire, but until your heart is willing, you will not do the work that needs to be done. The difference with David and it came to Saul, David's heart was willing. And that's all God needed. God needed David's heart to be willing, and therefore God was able to use David as that vessel. When it came to even Joseph being thrown in prison and sold by his brothers. See, that's even when you look at Joseph, the book of Joseph and the story of Joseph and how his brothers sold him to the slaves, and then he got thrown in prison and falsely accused by Potiphar's wife. Do you know the only reason why God could continue to utilize and use Joseph as a vessel? Because Joseph's heart was willing to be used. Joseph was not perfect. He was far from perfect, but he had a willing vessel. He had a willing heart. My point I'm making is this: as you do the shadow work, as you do the healing that needs to be done on yourself, God is not looking for us to be perfect. God is not looking for us to get it all right. God is not even looking for us to be perfection for him. But God said, if you are a willing vessel, if your heart is willing, I can work with you. Just like, I don't know where in the Bible where it talks about the clay and God molding us just like clay to become who God wants us to be for him. So if you look at it like that, we are the clay, and God is literally molding us to be who God needs us to be for him. And if you look at clay, when it comes to clay, you can mold clay however you want to mold it. You can create what you want to create out of clay. And that's how God does with us. We are the clay, and God literally will mold us and create and shape us into who he needs us to be for him. But God never said, I needed you to be this perfect vessel. I just needed you to be a willing vessel. I needed your heart to be willing. So here's what I say. People can try to fool you all day. People can fool other people all day. But one thing you can't fool is God. One thing you can't do is have the wrong motives towards God and what you're doing, because here is the thing. When God starts to use us as clay and mold us, and then God starts requiring us to do the shadow work and the healing, you're going to see if you are the willing vessel. So that's all I say when it comes to the shadow work and the healing. Understand this: you can't look at people and expect them to be the perfection or perception of who you want them to be for you. And I said this in the other video. You can't ask somebody to give you some water out of an empty cup they got. So if a person's cup is completely empty and they have no water in it, and you're asking them to give you some water out of their cup, where are they going to get the water from if their cup is completely empty? They can't give you anything. All they can give you is an empty cup of what they already have. So the shadow work does require you to see things and understand things in a different perspective, but the shadow work will also allow you to see that certain expectations, certain perceptions that you have of how you want people to be for you is not the reality of how it will be. You have to accept people right where they are. And that means even if they're not able to give you what you desire, that means you get the choice to exit and leave and start over somewhere else. And that is all part of the shadow work.